Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today we're looking at a set of texts that are arguably some of the most famous in American history. But I think they're also some of the most misunderstood, especially when you try to look at them through a systems lens.
Yeah.
We're digging into Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham Jail and his sermon, The Three Dimensions of a Complete Life.
And I think that's such a key point.
Mhm.
For most of us, we know the quotes. We hear injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And it's almost become like background noise from history class, right?
It has. It's been sanitized a little bit.
A lot.
Mm-hmm.
But today, our goal is different. We aren't just looking at the beautiful rhetoric or the specific historical events. We're looking at the mechanism.
Exactly. The systemic question that this source material is really trying to answer is this: how does an unjust system maintain its legitimacy, even when its brutality is, plain to see?
Right.
And then on the flip side of that, why is nonviolent direct action not just a protest method, but a structural necessity to introduce tension and actually force accountability?
It's so easy to look back at 1963 and think, well, obviously segregation was bad. It's a settled question for us. But the letter, he isn't really arguing with the KKK.
No, not at all.
He's arguing with the people who thought they were the good guys, the moderates. And the text shows how a system uses concepts like order and moderation and even time itself to neutralize change.
That is the absolute crux of it. This isn't just a history lesson about 1963. It's a deep analysis of how any power structure protects itself by defining what is and is not acceptable change.
So just a quick disclaimer before we really dive in. This deep dive is going to focus on the patterns, the structures, and the incentives that King lays out in the text. We're analyzing the logic of the system he's describing.
We're not prescribing, we're analyzing.
Exactly. So let's set the scene, because the context here is everything. It's not just what he wrote, but where he wrote it.
It's April 16th, 1963, Birmingham, Alabama, and Martin Luther King Jr. is in solitary confinement.
Solitary. That's an intense place to be writing from.
And he's not writing this at a comfortable desk. He was arrested for violating an injunction against protesting. He's leading a demonstration against, arguably, the most brutally and thoroughly segregated city in America at the time.
And he doesn't have paper.
No. He starts writing his response in the margins of a newspaper that someone smuggled into him. Then he's using scraps of toilet paper. Eventually, his lawyers managed to get him a legal pad. But this thing was born out of real constraint.
And who is he responding to? It's not the mayor. It's not the police chief.
No, and this is the critical part. He's responding to a public statement made by 8 white clergymen.
8 fellow religious leaders.
Correct. Protestant, Catholic, Jewish. These were not, fringe figures. They were the religious establishment. And they had published a statement in the local paper calling his activities, his protests in Birmingham, unwise and untimely.
Unwise and untimely. That phrasing is so specific. I want to pause on that because looking back now, it seems completely insane to call the civil rights movement unwise. But if we try to put ourselves in their shoes for just a second, what were they actually arguing? They weren't saying segregation is great, were they?
No, and that's the subtle trap. That's what makes their position so powerful and, from King's perspective, so dangerous. They were saying, we agree with your goal, but we strongly condemn your methods.
The classic, I agree with the what, but not the how.
Precisely. They were appealing to order. To them, street protests, sit-ins, boycotts, this was all just disrupting the peace. They argued that negotiation and the courts were the proper channel.
So they wanted him to sue his way to freedom.
Essentially, they argued that these demonstrations were extreme and that they were precipitating violence. And they also hit him with the outsider label. They said he was an outside agitator, stirring up trouble in a city that was, in their view, capable of solving its own problems on its own schedule.
So if you're just an average person in Birmingham reading the newspaper in 1963, these 8 clergymen, they probably sound like the voice of reason.
Absolutely. They sound like the calm, responsible adults in the room. Hey, let's all calm down. Let's not break laws. Let's just be patient. They represent the system of order.
And that's the system King decides to dismantle. This is where he puts on his hat, not just as a preacher, but as a system strategist.
A strategist, yes. He's not just acting as a moral leader here. He's the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC. He is performing a structural analysis of that reasonable argument to show how it actually functions as a primary tool of oppression.
And the sermon we're pairing this with, The Three Dimensions of a Complete Life, that gives us the other side of the coin, doesn't it? If the letter is about how to diagnose and break a corrupt external system,
Then the sermon is about how to build an internal system, an internal architecture, strong enough to survive that fight without being crushed.
So if we had to boil it down, just to give a clear thesis in plain language before we get into the details, what is it?
It's this. Unjust systems survive by claiming they're preserving peace. But that peace is really just the absence of tension. It's a negative peace.
A fragile quiet.
Exactly. And nonviolent direct action works by ripping the cover off that fragile quiet. It exposes the coercion that's always been there, just hidden. It forces the system to confront the massive gap between its stated ideals like democracy or Christian love and its brutal reality.
Okay, let's start unpacking this, because the first huge insight that just floored me reading this again was about who the real problem is, systemically. I think I grew up, and many of us did, thinking the villain of the civil rights movement was the guy in the white hood burning a cross.
The overt bigot, the easy target.
Yeah, but structurally, King argues that isn't the biggest stumbling block at all.
No. The text identifies a really surprising obstacle. It isn't the white citizens counselor. It's not the KKK member. He says the biggest problem is a white moderate.
That is such a heavy accusation. I mean, he basically says the moderate is more dangerous to the cause of freedom than the outright extremist. How does he justify that math? The KKK is bombing churches. The moderate is just, at home wishing things would quiet down. How is the person sitting at home the bigger systemic problem?
It all comes down to system design and the concept of a stumbling block. The KKK member is a known variable. They're an explicit enemy of justice. You know where they stand. The lines are clear. You can mobilize against them.
There's no confusion.
There's no confusion. But the moderate operates as a buffer, as a shock absorber for the system. King analyzes the moderate's devotion, and he uses that word devotion, to order over justice.
Order over justice, that's the core conflict.
That's the core conflict. King makes this absolutely critical distinction between two kinds of peace. He says there is negative peace, which is simply the absence of tension.
Things are quiet, no one's yelling, the boat isn't rocking. This is what the moderate wants above all else.
Yes. But the underlying problem, the segregation, the daily humiliation, the systemic violence, is still festering under the surface. It's still there.
It's the superficial piece.
Exactly. Versus what he calls positive peace, which is the active presence of justice. And the white moderate, he argues, will always choose the negative peace. They say, and this is a near direct quote, "I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action."
So they function as a kind of damper on the movement. They suck the energy out of it.
They become the gatekeepers of the timeline. This is a crucial point. King writes that they paternalistically believe they can set the timetable for another man's freedom.
That's an incredible phrase. Set the timetable for another man's freedom.
Isn't it? And he notes that their support is lukewarm. And he says lukewarm acceptance from a supposed friend is much more bewildering, much more frustrating than outright rejection from an enemy.
That makes perfect sense. If someone hates you, you know where you stand. The lines are drawn. But if someone says, "Oh, I support you, but just wait a little longer," or "don't be so loud," or "don't do it that way," they effectively drain all the urgency out of the movement.
It creates what he calls a dam that blocks the flow of social progress. The moderate is effectively saying, you can have justice, but only when it doesn't inconvenience my personal comfort or my sense of order. And that prioritization is precisely what allows the unjust system to keep on going, pretty much indefinitely.
So in this analysis, moderation isn't really a political position on a spectrum from left to right. It's a mechanical function within the system.
Its function is to absorb the energy of change and just dissipate it into nothing.
It neutralizes urgency.
It does. And this brings us right to the second major insight in the text, which is all about the law itself. Because the clergyman's main argument is, hey, you're breaking the law. You can't just pick and choose which laws to follow.
Which, on the surface, is a valid point, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, King even agrees with him on that. He says, I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. But if everyone just starts breaking laws they don't like, you get anarchy.
Right. Society falls apart.
So how does he draw the line? How does he distinguish between a law you are morally obligated to follow and a law you are morally obligated to break?
This is where he gets incredibly systematic. He offers what you could almost call a systems test or an algorithm for determining the legitimacy of a law. He doesn't base it on personal preference like, I don't feel like paying this tax. He offers 3, maybe 4 distinct objective tests.
Okay, let's run through them. What's the first one?
The first test is the moral or theological test. He's writing to clergymen, so he starts there. He says a just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law.
That feels a little subjective, though, doesn't it? I mean, what if you're not religious? Whose God are we talking about?
And he seems to anticipate that objection, which is why he immediately pivots to something much more universal. He calls it the personality test. And this is where he brings in the philosopher Martin Buber.
I saw that reference, the I-it versus I-thou relationship. Can you unpack what that actually means in a political, legal context?
Yeah, it's about the fundamental structure of relationships. An I-thou relationship is a relationship between two subjects, two full human beings who acknowledge each other's inherent dignity and humanity.
Okay. Person to person.
Person to person. An I-it relationship, on the other hand, is between a subject and an object. It's when you treat another person as a thing, a tool, a statistic, a means to an end.
So how does that apply to segregation laws?
King argues that segregation, by its very nature, is an I-it system. It is the legal thingification of a whole group of people. It turns persons into things. Therefore, any law that degrades human personality is unjust. He says it damages the soul of both the segregator and the segregated.
But then he gets even more concrete, more political. He gives a political power test, which I found to be the most clear and useful for a modern analysis. It's about who the law actually applies to.
This is the sameness made legal versus difference made legal concept. It's a brilliant structural audit, he says. An unjust law is a code that a numerical or power majority compels a minority group to obey, but does not make binding on itself.
So if I make a rule that says you can't sit at this lunch counter, but I can, that is literally difference made legal.
Correct. And that is structurally unjust because the feedback loop is broken. The lawmaker doesn't feel the negative consequences of their own law. But a just law, he says, is a code that a majority compels a minority to follow and is willing to follow itself. That is sameness made legal.
That completely removes the ambiguity. It's a simple, elegant test. It prevents that whole rules for thee but not for me dynamic that corrupts so many systems.
And he adds a final layer, a procedural one, the democratic test. He says a law is also unjust if it is inflicted on a minority that, due to being denied the right to vote, had no part in enacting or debating that law.
So the system is closed. Even if the law looks fair on paper, if the very people it affects were systematically barred from the voting booth, it's illegitimate.
Exactly. He points out that all throughout Alabama, there are counties where black people are in the majority, and yet not a single one is registered to vote. The system is rigged from the start.
And he makes one more distinction about how a law is applied.
Right. Sometimes a law is just on its face, but it becomes unjust in its application. And he uses his own arrest as the prime example. The charge was parading without a permit.
And, I mean, needing a permit for a big parade seems reasonable. That's a just law for public safety, for traffic control.
Of course. You don't want people blocking ambulances or causing chaos. But, he argues, when that ordinance is used specifically to maintain segregation and to deny citizens their First Amendment privilege of peaceful assembly and protest, it becomes an unjust tool in its application.
So when he decides to break that law, he's not trying to be an anarchist. He says he does it openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. What's the strategic purpose of that?
That is the crucial distinction he makes between his civil disobedience and, say, a common criminal. The criminal breaks the law to evade it, to hide from it. The civil disobedient breaks an unjust law to reveal its injustice. By accepting the penalty, by willingly going to jail, he's not showing contempt for law, he's showing the highest respect for the idea of law. He's acting as a mirror, forcing the community to look at itself and see the injustice of a law that puts a man like him in jail for seeking freedom.
That's a powerful idea. And it leads us right into the third major insight, which is about time. The clergymen say, wait. They say, these things take time. Progress is coming. Just be patient. King has a very, very different view of time.
This is one of the most powerful philosophical pivots in the entire letter. He calls the word wait a sedative. He specifically compares it to thalidomide, a notorious drug from that era that was meant to relieve stress but caused horrific birth defects.
Wow.
He says that for years he has heard the word wait, and it rings in the ear of every black person with piercing familiarity. He says this wait has almost always meant never.
He's fundamentally attacking the idea that time by itself fixes anything. We hear this kind of thing all the time, right?
Yeah.
The famous line he himself quoted elsewhere. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice.
And what he's saying here is not by itself it doesn't, it has to be bent. He challenges what he calls the myth of time, this irrational, lazy notion that the simple passage of time will inevitably cure all social ills.
It's the idea that if we just sit here and let the clock tick, the world will magically get better, like a fine wine or something.
Right, and King says that's a tragic misconception. He argues that time is neutral. It is just a container. It has no inherent moral direction. It can be used constructively or destructively.
And here's the system analysis part of it.
The system analysis is this. He argues that the forces of ill will and social stagnation have used time much more effectively than the forces of goodwill.
I saw a critique somewhere that described this in terms of physics, like entropy.
That is a perfect analogy. Think of a garden. If you do nothing, if you just wait, the garden doesn't magically plant itself with beautiful flowers. Weeds take over. Chaos takes over. That is the second law of thermodynamics applied to sociology.
So order and justice require a constant input of energy.
A constant input of tireless effort, as he puts it. Waiting is just letting the weeds grow while telling yourself a harvest is inevitable.
So if wait is the system's control mechanism to keep things stagnant, what's the antidote? And that brings us to insight number 4, tension.
Tension. The clergymen are terrified of tension. They write to him condemning the tension his protests are causing. They see tension as a breakdown of the system, as a failure of order.
Why are you causing all this trouble?
Exactly. But King flips that entirely. He views tension not as a byproduct of the work, but as a necessary design feature for correction. It's the goal.
He uses that incredibly visceral medical metaphor, the boil.
It's so powerful. He says injustice is like a boil. It can never be cured as long as it's covered up and hidden. It has to be opened with all its ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light. Only then can it heal.
So the protest isn't creating the tension. The infection is already there under the surface. The protest is just lancing the boil.
Precisely. Nonviolent direct action brings the hidden tension to the surface where it can finally be seen and dealt with, and he connects this directly to Socrates.
The gadfly.
Yes. Just as Socrates felt it was necessary to be a gadfly, to create a tension in the individual mind, to force people to move beyond myths and half-truths,
Right.
he argues that nonviolent gadflies are needed to create a tension in society, to liberate it from the bondage of racism and prejudice.
And the goal isn't to humiliate or defeat the opponent, is it?
No, absolutely not. The goal is to create a crisis, a constructive, nonviolent crisis, so profound, so unavoidable that the system cannot ignore it any longer and is forced to the negotiating table.
It forces the hidden issue onto the public agenda. It transforms the comfortable monologue of the powerful into an uncomfortable dialogue with the oppressed.
Correct. Because without that tension, the system will always default to the monologue. He says privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily. They only negotiate when the cost of maintaining the status quo becomes higher than the cost of change. The tension is what raises that cost.
So let's zoom out a bit now and actually map the system he's describing. He's very explicit about the actors and their roles.
Yeah.
We have the city and the state. He mentions Eugene Bullconnor, the Commissioner of Public Safety, who was infamous for his brutality.
Right, the fire hoses, the dogs, the symbol of violent oppression.
But he also mentions the newly elected mayor, Albert Boutwell, who was seen as a more gentle and reasonable figure.
And this is a key systems insight that is so relevant today. King warns against falling into the trap of thinking that just swapping the person fixes the machine. He says that while Boutwell is more gentle than Connor,
They're both segregationists.
they're both fundamentally dedicated to the maintenance of the unjust status quo. One does it with a snarling fire hose, the other does it with the polite smile, but the output of the system segregation remains exactly the same.
Then you have the police. And this is where his analysis gets really nuanced, because the clergymen had actually praised the police in their letter for their restraint and for preventing violence in public.
Yes, look how calm and professional the police are being.
And King just dismantles this. He acknowledges that, yes, in the public eye, the police exercised a certain discipline. They were nonviolent in their methods. But he asks the crucial systems question. For what purpose?
To what end?
To what end? And the end was to preserve the evil system of segregation.
Exactly. He says it is wrong to use immoral means to attain moral ends, like throwing a bomb to achieve justice. But it is perhaps even more wrong, more diabolical, to use moral means like nonviolence and professional restraint to preserve immoral ends.
That's a subtle but devastating point. If the police are polite while they enforce an apartheid system, their politeness becomes a tool of that system. It makes the system look legitimate and reasonable.
It creates a facade of order and legitimacy. It masks the structural violence of the law with the interpersonal politeness of the enforcer. It makes it much harder to critique the system because look how well behaved the officers are.
Then we have the church. And King. I mean, he saves some of his sharpest critique for his own institution. He calls them the thermometer.
He draws this brilliant contrast between the thermometer and the thermostat. This is one of the most durable metaphors in the whole text. A thermometer just records the temperature. It reflects popular opinion.
It just tells you what's already happening. Oh, it's 72 degrees in here. Oh, the congregation seems to be okay with segregation.
Right, it has no agency. But a thermostat changes the temperature, it regulates the environment. King argues that the early Christians were thermostats. They were disturbers of the peace who challenged the immoral mores of the Roman Empire.
But the modern church, in his view,
Has become a weak, ineffectual thermometer that just echoes the status quo. He worries it's becoming little more than an irrelevant social club, and he warns that if it doesn't recapture its sacrificial spirit, it will lose its authenticity.
And finally, in this map, we have the victim of the system. He describes the psychological state of the oppressed in this really gut-wrenching passage. He talks about the degenerating sense of nobodiness.
This is so important because it explains the urgency. It explains why wait is such a violent word. The wait we discussed earlier is easy for someone who isn't living inside that airtight cage of poverty. But inside the cage, you are watching your children's minds begin to distort. You're having to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park, Funtown, that's just been advertised on television. And you see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky.
It's crushing.
This psychological damage is a key output of the system. It's designed to grind down the human spirit to make it compliant.
Now let's look at the incentive structure within this system. Why protest? Why not just stick to negotiation? King explains the trap of negotiation without pressure.
He gives a concrete example from Birmingham. Before the protests, they had negotiations with the city's merchants. The leaders of the SCLC sat down with them,
Right.
and the merchants made promises. They promised to remove the humiliating racial signs from their stores. So in good faith, the civil rights leaders agreed to a moratorium on all demonstrations.
They played by the rules. They trusted the system's promise.
They did. And what was the result? The pressure lifted. A few signs came down for a little while, and then they went right back up. The promise was broken. The lesson here, for King the strategist, is that without the incentive of disruption, specifically economic disruption, the system will always revert to its default setting.
So the direct action, the boycotts of the downtown stores, the sit-ins at the lunch counters, was strategically timed to hit the merchants during the Easter shopping season, one of the biggest of the year.
It wasn't just about making noise. It was about attacking the balance sheet. It was about making the merchants feel the economic cost of maintaining the status quo. It aligns the incentive of the merchant, which is profit, with the goal of the protester, which is justice. Without that alignment of incentives, the merchant has no reason to change.
I want to touch on one specific feedback loop that King identifies. It's his logic of precipitating violence. The clergymen and many others blame the protesters for the violence that was committed against them.
This is a classic victim-blaming loop, and he exposes it so clearly. He uses this incredible analogy of a robbed man. He asks, is it logical to condemn a man who has been robbed because his possession of money precipitated the evil act of robbery?
It sounds absurd when you put it that way.
Or to condemn Socrates because his commitment to truth precipitated his being forced to drink hemlock? Or to condemn Jesus because his unique God consciousness precipitated the evil act of crucifixion?
It's like saying you shouldn't have carried that wallet if you didn't want to get mugged. It's completely backward.
But systems use this perverse logic constantly. If you asserting your basic rights triggers a violent reaction from the oppressor, and the system then blames you for provoking that violence, it creates a perfectly closed loop where no objection is ever possible or legitimate. It neutralizes the victim's agency entirely.
It reframes the person demanding justice as the agitator.
Exactly. The narrative frames dissent as disorder, and this shows up in the specific labels King lists. Outside agitator, untimely, extremist. These aren't just insults. They are narrative tools to maintain the system.
Let's talk about that outside agitator label. King has that famous line, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
He completely rejects the premise. He argues that no one who lives inside the United States can ever be considered an outsider anywhere within its borders. But the label itself is a very specific narrative weapon.
What does it do?
It implies that the local population is content, that the system is fine. It suggests that all the unrest is being imported, like a virus, from somewhere else. It denies the reality that the tension is internal, that the problem is homegrown.
And then there's the term extremist. The clergymen use this as a slur against him. But King, he does this kind of rhetorical jujitsu with it, doesn't he?
He does. It's brilliant. First, he actually rejects the label. He positions himself as the moderate within the Black community. He says, look, I stand in the middle of two opposing forces. On one side are those who've become complacent and given up, and on the other side are the Black nationalist groups who are filled with hatred and are advocating for violence. He says his path of nonviolent resistance is the creative middle way.
But then, after defending himself as a moderate, he completely flips it and embraces the extremist label.
He reclaims it. He says, you know what, maybe I am an extremist. And then he asks, was not Jesus an extremist for love? Love your enemies, bless them that curse you.
Was not Amos an extremist for justice?
Was not Paul an extremist for the Christian gospel? Was not Martin Luther an extremist? Was not Abraham Lincoln an extremist? Was not Thomas Jefferson an extremist? He reframes the entire spectrum. He says the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be.
Are you an extremist for hate or an extremist for love? For the preservation of injustice or the extension of justice?
Exactly. He argues that the middle of the road is not always the moral high ground. Sometimes the middle is just comfortable complicity with a terrible system.
So, connecting all of this to the present day, obviously the specific laws have changed. We're not in 1963 Birmingham. But these patterns, these systemic functions, they feel incredibly familiar.
They are structural recurrences. They pop up again and again. Look at almost any modern protest cycle anywhere in the world. You will hear the same order narratives deployed against them.
I support their cause, but why do they have to block the highway?
Why are they so disruptive? Why can't they protest quietly in a way that doesn't inconvenience anyone? That is the voice of the white moderate from 1963 speaking today, is the prioritization of the absence of tension over the presence of justice.
And the institutional response often seems to follow that same pattern.
It often follows the pattern of the Birmingham merchants, yes. You get symbolic concessions. A commission is formed. A strongly worded statement is released. A diversity officer is hired. A sign is taken down. But as soon as the pressure, the tension of the protest is released, does the deep structural change follow?
Not always.
Often not. You see a reversion to the mean because the pressure was removed too early. The incentive to change disappeared.
And the labeling. Extremist. Radical. Agitator.
It remains a primary tool for defining the boundaries of what is considered acceptable political discourse. By labeling someone or some tactic as extreme, the system sends a powerful signal to the moderates that this is something they should disengage from. It isolates the agent of change.
This links so perfectly to our channel's core theme, crisis and perception. We have this natural human tendency to look for individual villains. We want to find a bad guy with a mustache to blame for the problem.
But King's analysis is a systems analysis. He consistently steers us away from that. He says the problem isn't just the bad men like Bull Connor, it's the appalling silence of the good people. The system runs on the fuel of that silence. It relies on the good people choosing to be thermometers rather than thermostats.
And it creates this deeply flawed perception about time. We have this perception, this hope, that progress just rolls in on the wheels of inevitability.
It's a very comforting but very dangerous perception. Systems analysis shows us that entropy is the default. Without a constant input of energy, without what King calls tireless effort and co-workers of God, systems don't naturally improve. They decay or they calcify.
There's also this powerful concept of interdependence that runs through both the letter and the sermon. King talks about the inescapable network of mutuality.
Tied in a single garment of destiny. This is basically a systems biology concept applied to society. You can't have a healthy liver in a dying body. The injustice in Birmingham poisons the system of justice in New York. A system that ignores its own deep interconnectedness is fooling itself, and it's ultimately fragile.
Which is a perfect segue to the sermon, the 3 dimensions of the complete life. Because if you are going to be a thermostat, if you're going to be the one who stands up and creates this necessary tension, that is an exhausting and dangerous job.
It's incredibly draining, spiritually, physically, emotionally, and King knew this from personal experience. He realized you cannot fight a system like that if you are hollow inside. You need a robust internal structure that can withstand that immense external pressure.
So he breaks it down into 3 dimensions: length, breadth, and height.
Oh.
Let's start with length.
The length of life, King defines, is the inward concern for one's own welfare. It's the development of one's own inner resources. At its root, it is rational and proper self-love.
Which sounds a bit selfish, doesn't it? Especially coming from a Christian preacher.
And he acknowledges that. The Bible says to love your neighbor as yourself. But as he points out, if you don't love yourself, you can't properly love your neighbor. He quotes Rabbi Joshua Liebman, "Love thyself properly. You have to accept yourself."
And for the African-American community in 1963, facing a system that relentlessly told them they were nobody, that they were inferior, that was a revolutionary act.
It was a revolutionary act of psychological resistance. He has that great line about the Ford and the Cadillac.
Yeah.
He says, a Ford car trying to be a Cadillac is an absurd spectacle. But if a Ford accepts itself as a Ford, it can do things a Cadillac can never do, like fit into tight parking spaces. It's about accepting your own unique tools and value. It's the foundation of his famous statement, "I'm black and I'm beautiful." You have to have that internal solidity first.
He also tells that story of the street sweeper.
One of his most famous rhetorical flourishes, he says, if it is your lot in life to be a street sweeper, then sweep streets like Michelangelo painted pictures. Sweep streets like Beethoven composed music. Sweep streets so well that all the hosts of heaven and earth will have to pause and say, here lived a great street sweeper who did his job well.
It's about achieving excellence and dignity in your own life, whatever your station. That's the length. But if you stop there...
If you stop there, you're just a self-centered egoist. You're a cul-de-sac. Your life hasn't achieved its full potential. You need the second dimension, breadth.
And breadth is the outward concern for the welfare of others. And to illustrate this, he uses the parable of the Good Samaritan.
He does this brilliant systems analysis of why the priest and the Levite passed by the injured man on the Jericho road. They were the religious and respectable people.
Yeah, he speculates. Maybe they were in a hurry to get to a church service. Maybe they had a strict religious rule about not touching a dead body, and they thought the man was dead.
But then he suggests the real reason was probably something simpler: fear. The Jericho Road was known as the Bloody Pass. It was dangerous, winding, perfect for ambushes. He admits that when he was on that road himself, he was a little afraid.
So the priest and the Levite ask a very specific, self-interested question.
The priest and the Levite ask, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me?
Will I get robbed? Will I be late? Will I become unclean?
But the Good Samaritan, the outsider, he reverses the question. He asks, if I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him?
That's the shift. That's everything.
That is the structural shift from a life of length to a life of breadth. It's the moment the change agent is born. You have to move from pure self-preservation to community preservation. And he connects this back to that idea of interdependence with the breakfast analogy.
Oh, I loved this part. He breaks down the global supply chain that goes into a simple American breakfast.
He says, before you even finish your morning coffee, you are already dependent on half the world. The sponge for your bath is from a Pacific Islander. The soap is from a Frenchman. The coffee is poured into your cup by a South American. The toast is from an English-speaking farmer. Structurally, we are already one human family. Breadth is just living in a way that acknowledges that reality.
So we have length,
Yeah.
self, and breadth, others. But he says a life isn't complete, isn't three-dimensional without height.
Height, which is the upward reach toward God or some transcendent moral truth.
And he's pretty blunt about this. He says you can have length and breadth, but without height, life becomes a flat, dreary plane. It loses its meaning.
He argues that the human spirit needs a connection to something eternal, something that changes not. In a system where laws are unjust, where politicians are fickle, where wait means never, you need an ultimate reference point that is outside of that corrupt system, a North Star.
He talks about the danger of practical atheism.
Right. He says he's not so concerned with theoretical atheism people arguing philosophically that there is no God. He's concerned with practical atheism, people who profess to believe in God, but who live their lives as if God doesn't exist. People who get so caught up in the man-made lights of the city that they forget to look up at the eternal stars.
And for King, this wasn't just, theological fluff. This was his survival mechanism.
Yeah.
And he tells that incredibly moving story of Sister Pollard.
It's a beautiful anecdote. It was during the Montgomery bus boycott. The movement was a year old. King was exhausted, he was receiving death threats daily, he was faltering, and this elderly woman from his congregation, Sister Pollard, comes up to him.
And she sees right through his brave face.
She sees he's losing heart, and she says to him, "The white folks are doing something to you." And she tells him, "Even if we ain't with you, the Lord is with you." And then she says that famous, profound line, "My feet is tired, but my soul is at rest."
That distinction, my feet are tired, but my soul is at rest, that is the direct result of having that third dimension,
Yeah.
of having height.
It's what provides the stamina. If you only rely on length, your own ego and strength, and breadth, your community's support, you might burn out. Your ego can be crushed. Your community might fail you. But height connects you to a deep moral law that King believes is woven into the fabric of the universe itself. It's what allows him to say with confidence, "I do not know what the future holds, but I know who holds the future."
So bringing it all together as we close out, the unjust system he describes, it demands order.
Which is that negative piece, the absence of tension.
But the complete life that he describes, it demands justice.
Which is positive peace, the presence of justice.
And the tension that the moderates were so afraid of.
The tension is not a mistake. The tension is the natural, unavoidable friction that is generated when those two demands meet. It is the heat created when the complete life, with its length, breadth, and height, pushes back against the unjust system.
And King's final argument is, don't run from that heat, don't cover the boil, use the tension as the energy source to transform the system.
We must move from being passive thermometers that just reflect the cold reality of the world to being active thermostats that have the courage to regulate and change it.
That's a powerful place to land. It really makes you look at disruption differently, not as a nuisance, but as a necessary, maybe even healthy signal from a system in crisis.
And it challenges us to look at our own lives. Do we have length, a healthy self-respect? Do we have breadth, a genuine concern for others? And do we have height, a connection to something that gives us the strength to keep going when our feet get tired?
That was a deep dive into Letter from Birmingham Jail and the Three Dimensions of a Complete Life by Martin Luther King, Jr. I highly encourage you to read the full text. You can find them in almost any library or online archives. It's worth sitting with the original words.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.